Hello, welcome back to the second video in this three-part video series on trauma and regulation. Once again, my name is Brianna McNanny, and I'm very excited to present our second topic, which is sensory regulation. This video explores what sensory processing is, how sensory processing is impacted by stress and trauma, and some specific sensory strategies we can use to reduce sensory-related outbursts and concerns in foster youth in our care. Before we begin, let's review the first principle of TBRI, or trust-based relational intervention, which is the empowering principle. If you remember, individuals who have suffered trauma are always in the fight, flight, and freeze mindset. The brains have been hardwired to expect trouble, and so they're always on edge. This constant vigilance actually changes how their brains interpret the world around them. The interpretation deficits can impact the youth's ability to be aware of their own body, their coordination, their language skills, their attention, academic performance, behaviors, and more. Basically, when a youth has experienced trauma, these experiences can result in chronic stress, which impacts how the brain processes information. This, in turn, can impact every aspect of a youth's life. We use the empowering principle to create a sense of safety to reduce the stress cycle. And one of the major approaches to create this safety is through sensory processing and sensory modulation. So, let's get started looking at the senses. So you may be wondering, what is the sensory system? How does it relate to negative behavioral outcomes, and what can be done to help? Well, the sensory system is comprised of the body's 5 common senses, which are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, along with 2 additional senses, which are proprioception and vestibular. Sensory processing is how the brain receives and processes sensory information from the environment. So let's look at each of these senses and determine how they work typically, and examine what each might look like when there's a dysfunction. First, let's take a look at the visual system. The visual system is a combination of how well our eyes work, meaning whether they can structurally see the world around us, and how well our brains can turn what we see into useful information. Despite what you may think, having difficulty seeing is not actually part of the sensory system of vision. If an individual only needs glasses or has a visual impairment, they don't have a sensory problem with their vision. They have a structural problem. However, if that same individual is distracted by bright lights, or busy patterns, or has difficulty finding objects that are right in front of them, they may have a sensory visual deficit, where their brain is actually having difficulty interpreting the visual information that their eyes are seeing. The auditory system is much like the visual system, in that it deals with how well our ears are able to hear sounds from the world around us, and also how our brain interprets that sound and makes sense of it. Normally, we can go about our day and tune out the sounds that are necessary to tune out, pay attention to the ones that we need to, but if an individual has difficulty with auditory processing, they might be distressed by loud noises, distracted in loud environments and unable to pay attention to one thing, or even just distracted by background sounds such as the air conditioner or an analog clock, the sound of a fan going off. These individuals might also be seen as zoning out or tuning out when you're talking to them because they're distracted by other sounds in their environment. The olfactory system, or our sense of smell, is primarily concerned with how well our body is able to pay attention to or ignore threatening and non-threatening smells. Normally, we're able to, if we smell something, we say, our brain kind of categorizes it as this is threatening, this is not threatening. And if it's not threatening, then we kind of eventually stop smelling it. But individuals who have difficulty with their olfactory system may never be able to stop smelling it. If they notice a smell that they dislike, they're going to continue to be bothered by it, even long after the smell is gone. Or they may be undersensitive to smells, and they may smell everything because they're just curious or because their brains are seeking more information from the world around them. The oral system actually has two senses. It has taste and texture. Typically, for us, we're able to try new foods, experience things. We're not going to be putting everything in our mouths. But individuals who have difficulty with their oral system may have trouble doing this. Those who have issues with taste may only eat foods that are familiar to them instead of trying new foods or eating a balanced diet. They may prefer eating strongly flavored foods or really bland foods, depending on whether they're more sensitive or less sensitive to taste. Individuals who have issues or difficulties with texture may prefer one texture of food over others. They may avoid eating soft or mushy foods. A lot of kids and youth prefer eating crunchy or hard foods as it gives more sensory input into their mouths. These kids may also be the ones who chew on non-food objects around the home, such as pencils, pens, their lips. Occasionally you'll even see people pick up things off the ground and just start chewing on them, which can be dangerous depending on what they pick up. The sense of touch, or also known as the tactile sense, is the last of the traditional senses of the body. This sensory system is involved with what a person chooses or is willing to touch, as well as how they react to different textures of clothing and other objects. Typically, just like with smell, the brain's able to kind of filter out what tactile information you need to focus on and what you don't need to focus on. So, for example, when I get dressed in the morning, I don't have to focus on what my clothing feels like on my body, whether there's a tag in the back of my shirt or whether there's a seam in the leg of my pants. But an individual who has a tactile sensory problem may only be able to focus on these things. They may always feel that tag tickling the back of their neck, or the rough fabric of their jeans, or the seam going down the side of their leg. Many times these youth are displayed as being very sensitive to clothing textures, the seams, the tags. They'll be unwilling to touch certain objects or textures depending on whether they like the feeling of it. Or if they seek more information, they may be the ones who touch everything. They have to have their hands on everything all the time. They seem to have no boundaries whatsoever. Now let's take a look at a couple of the less traditional senses, proprioception and vestibular. I like to think of proprioception as the body's pressure and placement gauge. This system tells us where our body is in relation to the world around us. It can also tell us how much or how little pressure we are applying to an object. An individual who has deficits with proprioception may walk with heavy feet. They may kind of slap their feet on the ground when they're walking or stomp a lot. They may push really hard or really softly with pencils and pens when they're writing, or when they're using a fork. They may have difficulty stabbing food, or they may practically stab through the plate. These youth may be the ones who become very distressed when they are touched, especially if they're touched lightly. This can be seen as very threatening to them. They may intentionally bump into objects to get more input. And these youth may also display self-harming behaviors, such as hitting parts of their body, hitting their head on the floors or walls, and other such self-harming behavior that gives them pressure throughout limbs or different parts of their body. The vestibular system goes alongside the proprioceptive system, and it gives us our sense of balance and spatial orientation, as well as our sense of movement. Youth who have difficulty with their visual system may be unintentionally clumsy. They may bump into objects because they don't quite understand the distance between them. They may display as having poor balance, and they may be incredibly hyperactive. Dysfunctions in the sensory system go by different names, and there are four main categories of these dysfunctions. An individual can have low registration for sensory input. These are the individuals who don't notice sensory information. They may be the youth who will bump into people or walls. They'll walk around without a coat on a really cold day. They'll ignore you when you're talking, and so forth. Youth can also be sensory seeking. These are the youth who just can't sit still. They're always touching something, bumping into things, moving, chewing on things. They can be sensory avoiding. These are the youth who try to avoid sensory stimulations by withdrawing. They don't want to be touched. They don't like loud noises or bright lights. Finally, there are youth who are just generally sensitive to sensory input. These youth they overreact to sensory information. They just notice it more. They may be distressed by clothing or noises. They may react violently to sensory stimulation. They're so aware of everything going on around them, and everything seems really threatening because their brains just aren't able to categorize sensory information the way ours can. It's important to note that not all youth have the same sensory reaction, even if they've had the same trauma. And some youth can have different reactions for different senses. A youth can be sensory seeking for oral information, meaning they're putting everything in their mouths, but they might be sensory avoiding for textures of clothing or for touch. It all depends on how their sensory system is arranged, and it's not the same for any youth, so it's important that we tailor everything to each individual youth and to their individual needs. So I understand that was quite a bit of information, so let's do a little bit of a main takeaway here. The 7 senses are the foundation for higher functions. Dysfunctions in these senses can cause dysfunction in the youth's ability to interpret the world around them and remain aware of their own body. This in turn can impact their ability to participate in their higher functioning skills, such as coordination, academic achievement, behavioral regulation, and so forth. So, now that that's kind of clear as mud, how can we help the youth in our care with their sensory processing? Well, this is where a sensory diet and a sensory toolbox come in really handy. The sensory toolbox is a set of items or sensory approaches that can be used to meet the sensory needs of those who have sensory processing difficulties. These are not individualized tools. These are just generalized tools that we use trial and error to see which ones work and which ones don't. Once we determine which ones do work for our youth, we then create a sensory diet, which is a set of specific tools that have been tailored to that individual person's specific sensory needs. While we're trying to determine what the best sensory tools are that we can use and include in our sensory diet, we can use the ABC log as a way to track this. An ABC log stands for the triggering antecedent, the reaction behavior, and the response or consequence. So the example given here is the child is asked to get into the car, and then their reaction or the behavior is that they throw themselves down on the ground and make it so they cannot be moved. And the consequence would be a caregiver sitting on the ground with the child. And then there's the child's response. In this particular instance, they begin to talk about their concerns. We do the same thing with the ABC log using our sensory data. If a child is bothered when you touch their arm and they scream or hit you, then the response is maybe you use a sensory technique such as deep pressure or a massager on their arm before touching them. And then you record their response of whether that sensory intervention was helpful or not. This is a good way of using an ABC log to determine what sensory tools are beneficial and what should be included in the sensory diet. So let's take a look at some of these tools. We'll start with the tools that are often used with youth who become overstimulated easily. Let's start by looking at some generic environmental changes that you can use that might prevent sensory overload. Some of these changes are keeping the lighting lower. Instead of using overhead lights, maybe use lamps with lamp shades to keep the lighting dimmer in the environment. Keeping the home visually uncluttered can prevent overload and with youth who have visual overload. Using scentless cleaning products or only products that have gentler smells like lavender can prevent youth who have olfactory overload and sensation and become easily sensory overwhelmed with smells. And also just using softer fabrics and providing clothing without rough seams and tags can prevent youth from becoming bothered by these things without ever having to cause a problem. Some other sensory tools that may be beneficial but aren't exactly environmental changes are giving sunglasses to youth who have light sensitivity before leaving the house, or providing noise-canceling headphones or over-the-ear headphones that playing soft classical music for those who have auditory processing problems. Also, allowing a youth to wear hats, which slightly tighter hats that provide the kind of pressure to the scalp, can really help youth keep themselves calm without becoming overwhelmed when they're exposed to environmental and other stressors. Wearing these hats is a form of deep pressure, which is a type of proprioceptive input that can often help youth feel calm and just give them extra input and help them avoid being overwhelmed or even hyperactive in sensory environments. One form of deep pressure that you can use with your foster youth are bear hugs. Bear hugs work much like swaddling an infant. They provide uniform deep pressure throughout the body, although it's important to remember that a bear hug needs to always be consensual. Before giving a bear hug, you must get permission from the youth. During the bear hug, if a youth begins to squirm, move away, or decides they no longer want the bear hug, you must immediately stop. This helps them feel like they're in control of their own environment. A deep pressure technique that youth can do for themselves or use for themselves is a weighted blanket. Weighted blankets come in multiple different sizes, but the good rule of thumb is they should always be between 7 and 12% of a youth's body weight. Thankfully, on most packages of weighted blankets, they do have a little chart telling you how heavy of a weighted blanket to get, depending on how heavy a youth is. It's important with weighted blankets to remember never to make the youth feel like they're being tied down or trapped underneath the blanket. Allow them to use it how they will. They can either lay down with it on top of them, sit with it around their shoulders, sit with it in their lap. You really want them to feel like they have control over how it's used and when it's used. Some good alternatives to weighted blankets are weighted lap pads or weighted stuffed animals. Weighted lap pads can be really helpful for when sitting and doing homework, when sitting in class, or even just when sitting at the dinner table, especially if the youth tend to be very wiggly. Weighted lap pads tend to be about 5 pounds, and they just sit gently on the child's lap or other body parts to help give them that extra proprioceptive input. A weighted stuffed animal, like the one that you see here, tend to be around 2.5 to 5 pounds, and they can be used very similar to a weighted lap pad. They're also very helpful at night for having it on a child's chest, having them hold it in their arms. And they just once again give that extra proprioceptive input to the youth to help them feel calm. Some of the final proprioceptive and deep pressure techniques we can use are more self-pressure techniques. These are techniques like seen here in these pictures, like chair push-ups, doing dots and squeezes on the arms and hands, pushing on the top of the head, pulling on the fingers, pushing your hands together as hard as you can, or doing wall push-ups. These are just really good techniques to give proprioceptive input through the joints and through the body, and they also give youth a bit more control over using their own techniques, and they can be directed in these techniques so they can eventually use them without having to be directed. Since we've been talking about youth who overreact to sensory input, I feel like it'd be doing a disservice if we didn't talk about some specific strategies that can help with some of the most often areas where youth will overreact, which is during some personal hygiene tasks. A lot of times, youth who have sensory difficulties will have difficulties with things like hair brushing, teeth brushing, and getting dressed in the morning. So one thing you can do for a youth who has difficulty with brushing their teeth is to have them use an electric toothbrush prior to or during the toothbrushing process. The sensation of the electric toothbrush can help desensitize the gums and make toothbrushing less distressing because they're feeling the vibration and they're not feeling the scraping of the toothbrush against their teeth. Another option for youth who have difficulty with having their hair brushed or washed, or getting dressed in the morning, or even being touched, is to use a gentle like handheld massager or scalp massager on the arms, legs, or scalp before hair brushing or dressing, or even being touched. Once again, that vibrational feeling just gives extra sensation and kind of desensitizes them to a single sensation of being touched or the hairbrush pulling in their hair. It can make them a lot less likely to become distressed and upset. Now let's take a look at some strategies that can be used for youth who have difficulty paying attention or just may need a break. These strategies can be used for youth who are appearing fatigued and tired, who are hyperactive and wiggling around a lot, or just been concentrating for a really long time and may just need a bit of a chance to move around and not focus as much on one thing. So, the first thing we can do is start with physical activity. You want to give the youth a time to just get out and be active. You can get the blood pumping, get their brains kind of away from the singular event they were trying to focus on. You can also give them a bit of a break if they're having difficulty focusing. So some good examples of physical activity is jumping. It's like jumping on a trampoline, jumping around the house, jumping on the couch, doing somersaults or rolling around on the floor to get that really good vestibular movement, spinning around in circles or sitting on an office chair and spinning around in circles, dancing, doing yoga, anything to get the blood moving and to kind of really involve all the senses of spatial awareness, proprioception. Afterwards, the next thing we can do is anything to relax. We can do deep pressure techniques and proprioceptive strategies, listen to calm music, apply lotion to the hands or feet or face. We can also do things like deep breathing techniques. What's important to remember is that you always want to include proprioceptive and deep pressure techniques following really active techniques such as jumping, spinning, running, dancing. Otherwise, the body's going to continue being hyperactive and have difficulty calming down. These strategies are very helpful. They're to use as brain breaks, like we talked about, during transitions. They can also be helpful before bed or before school. But if you're doing them before bed or before school, you want to make sure you have at least 30 minutes before the youth needs to concentrate or fully relax and calm down, or else they may still be hyperactive by the time they go to sleep. Remember, the sensory toolbox strategies and sensory diets are trial and error, and the ones that I explained and gave you here are not all the ones in existence. It may take some time to find out what works best for the youth in your care, and you may need to get a little bit creative. Just know that nothing you do is wrong so long as it's helping, and so long as no one's getting hurt. If you would like to find some more sensory strategies, you can always check out spdstar.org, which is a website for sensory processing disorder. Well, even though our youth may not have sensory processing disorder, a lot of the strategies given on this website can be beneficial. You can also ask for a referral to occupational therapy if you have a concern about your youth's sensory processing. Well, that's the end of our second video on sensory regulation and sensory processing. I look forward to seeing you for our last video of this series, which is emotional and behavioral regulation. Have a good day. Thanks for watching.